Okay, this is a review I've wanted to do for a while, but I didn't know how to present it exactly since I have it on Kindle, and so I'm going to have to show you the picture on my telephone machine. So there is the cover. This is X Descending by Christian P. Lambright. Two extraordinary films reveal the lies, deception, and truth about unidentified flying objects. Now, this is probably one of the better books that I've ever read on the subject of UFOs. And as I've stated in many other uh, reviews, I am something of an alien agnostic, and I say that just because that is such an extraordinary claim to say that there's aliens zipping around the Earth in spaceships. That I think that requires, of course, extraordinary evidence. Now, I don't rule that out. I don't think that that's impossible, but to me, there's also an element of human deception that needs to be kind of strained out, as it were, of that. But that brings us back to Mr. Lambright's work. And he does a fantastic job. If ever there was a book that really puts me on the fence as far as are there aliens or not, or are we being visited by extraterrestrials with superior technology, Mr. Lambright provides some of the best argument for that case. And really, he's not necessarily arguing that case. He's more presenting you with some really solid evidence. And it's up to you to kind of take that and assemble what you want out of it. And I think that's also a very wise approach on his part, because this is such a taboo field that's marked by all kinds of crazy assertions and implications and a lot of speculation. So Mr. Lambright does a great job of staying, he states in the introduction that this is his opinion, this is what he's discovered, and this is how we grow and investigate, is by figuring this out and contributing. So anyway, what's this about? Now, those of you who have followed some of my books and stuff on that I've reviewed about cattle mutilations and that sort of thing will really find this interesting, because Mr. Lambright personally knew Paul Benowitz. So anyway, this requires, for this, I need to kind of backtrack and do a little bit of quick storytelling. So in the late 70s, like 78, 79, Paul Benowitz, who ran a laboratory outside of Kirtland Air Force Base and Sandia Labs in New Mexico, and he lived in Albuquerque in a residential area on the southeast side of Albuquerque, right on the edge of the Air Force Base. And he sold scientific equipment to the labs there. So this guy was not just some Yahoo that had ideas about UFOs. This was a very scientifically oriented individual who knew his stuff. And Paul began to take an interest in some of the stories about cattle mutilation and that sort of thing, and started looking around the area around him, and found also he would, at night, he saw some strange lights over in the Air Force property. And of course, in those days, it was mainly 8mm film that people were using. So he used his 8mm film to record this, and actually recorded a fair amount of good quality 8mm video, or I'm sorry, 8mm film of these, what appeared to be disc-shaped craft or something like that, taking off and landing at Kirtland Air Force Base. And they were landing within the area, the very controlled area where the nuclear storage area, the weapon storage area. So he saw this as being a major security issue for the Air Force, and being the patriotic American that he was, he of course went to the Air Force with this. Now also, before this happened, he had also been corresponding with, I believe, Gabe Valdez in Dulce, New Mexico, about some of the cattle mutilations and some of that. So he had done quite a bit of research up to this point, and that's really important here, because as soon as he turned this over to the Air Force and said, hey guys, I think he believed that the Air Force Base was being infiltrated by someone from the outside with advanced spacecraft. Now, the Air Force's reaction was very interesting. At first, he was kind of blown off, but then they took a very serious interest in him. And Richard Doty, and if you are familiar with this story, you know that name. Richard Doty, he was the AFOSI, or the Air Force Office of Special Investigations officer assigned to this. And he took Paul under his wing and confided in Paul all kinds of information about aliens, UFOs, that sort of thing. Now, this is where the water gets really muddy. And again, Mr. Lambright does an excellent job of giving you a good timeline of it and showing how some of the players are interrelated in a way that up until his book, I did not realize. He points out that Paul most likely, and I'm paraphrasing here, most likely stumbled onto some very classified activity happening at Kirtland Air Force Base. Now, they could have told Paul, back off, this is classified stuff here, back off, stay out of it, and leave it alone. And Paul most likely would have done exactly that, because I think if he knew that what he was looking at was classified weapons research or something, he would have backed off and that would be the end of it. And he would have felt like he was doing his duty to not expose this. As it was, he felt like there was something big going on and the Air Force wasn't taking it seriously. And he became more and more, as Richard Doty started feeding him more and more information, became more and more paranoid. And I'm going to condense this down because there's so much to this. I could spend all night just on the Paul Benowitz story. But the sad part about this is he most likely stumbled onto something of great import. And I think that is the thing that gets lost sometimes in the telling of this story, is you had a very smart guy that was no dummy picking up on some kind of major activity happening within the Air Force Base. What that is to this day, we don't know exactly. He also most likely stumbled onto some very strange activity in northern New Mexico. And that, of course, also remains a mystery. But here's where, sadly, the Air Force, instead of diffusing that situation, started to instead pile on more fuel on that fire and started deliberately filling him full of ideas about alien underground bases and battles with aliens, and there was imminent alien invasion. A lot of very, very strange, very questionable stuff. And the saddest part is they used informants within the UFO community who Paul thought were his friends, such as Moore, I believe was his name. I can't think of his last name right off the top of my head, but Moore, the guy who wrote the book about the Roswell crash, was one of the guys instrumental in kind of at a ground level helping feed Paul a lot of disinformation. So the book tells a lot of that story. It also tells about, and this is the fascinating thing about this particular book, is it's bringing together a lot of diverse parts of the UFO story and kind of bringing them all together so that you can see how they're related. Many of you have probably heard of John Lear. Now, John Lear, of course, also was heavily involved in that campaign of spreading this idea of secret alien bases and wars between the Delta Force and the aliens and that sort of thing. One of the really fascinating things that Lambright uncovers in this is the relationship between John Lear and Richard Doty, and both of them served at a CIA listening post in Laos in Cambodia. And he makes a pretty good case for these guys both being actually what's typically called sheep-dipped CIA that had an Air Force cover, but were actually CIA. And that Richard Doty was and probably is still in the employ of the CIA as a disinfo agent. That, I think, that alone is worth getting this book and reading that part, because your opinion about Richard Doty and what all he has introduced or injected rather into the UFO mythos really deserves close scrutiny once you start realizing him and John Lear's relationship and all that. Now, the other thing, and I'll stop with this because again, there's so much in here. I know I'm not going to do it justice summarizing it all, but let's just say it's on Kindle. It's easy to find. I think you can easily pick this up on Amazon or whatever. But highly recommend it if you're into studying disinformation and how that's used and the tactics used, especially how the UFO community was used in this instance to spread disinformation. But here's the other really fascinating part from the potentially extraterrestrial part of this story is Lambright knew and visited, and I think this gentleman is still alive. I think his name is Ray Stanford. Filmed several UFOs with good equipment, has very good film and video of some really clear UFO footage. But if I remember right from my full reading of this book, is that Stanford has not ever released this publicly. He thinks a lot of this is too important to just dump this out there, that some of this stuff needs to be properly analyzed and that sort of thing. Lambright had the privilege of watching these original films, and then he reproduces in drawing some of the things in the way what he saw in those films. What he points out is that there's in some of the clear films that he has of this one disc aircraft flying, is the disc, normally we think of a disc flying this way, and this disc is turned on edge, flying, you would think, the least aerodynamic way possible, like this. And on the top appears to be some kind of spike emanating some kind of beam out of this spike that seems to be creating some kind of envelope in which it can travel through the atmosphere. Now I know what you're thinking. Well, okay, what's the big deal? Why does that mean anything? Well, so one of the gentlemen who wanted to look at this film and analyze it was Leek Mirabeau. I think I'm saying his name right. Leek Mirabeau. If you look up Mirabeau, spelt with a Y, M-Y-R. Anyway, Mirabeau, I'm not going to be able to pull it all up right now, but Mirabeau studied that or looked at that, and from that he was able to mimic some of those aerodynamic principles in his Lightcraft project using this aluminum disc, and I think you can actually watch some of the Mirabeau test footage where he used that to actually pioneer some new aeronautic principles. So really fascinating there that you had these I don't want to say secret, but these somewhat confidential UFO films that only a few people were allowed to see, and some of the aerospace people who did view them were then able to use that to pioneer new exotic propulsion and aerodynamic ideas. So that is definitely a fascinating part of this book. But I'm going to stop there because, like I said, there's so much to this. I know I'm not going to do it justice trying to summarize the whole thing. But if you are interested in the story of Paul Benowitz, and if you've read Project Beta is not near as comprehensive and really doesn't do a good job of really scrutinizing Richard Doty the way that X Descending does. And he does a much better job of really digging into the past of some of these guys and the connections of some of these guys, some of the key players in this story. So again, can't recommend it enough. My only complaint with this, and if you're Christian Lambright, if you're watching this, my only complaint is I wish this was in print form so I could dog-ear the pages and mark it up accordingly, because I think this is a really important book, and this is the kind of thing that it does drive me nuts to go to my phone for this. But I will say, to his credit, there's a lot of good stuff in here, a lot of good pictures, a lot of documents that you can pull up in this. So lots of good information. I really wish, I'm a very tactile kind of guy, and I would really love to have a copy of this book in an actual printed form. But other than that, fantastic book, and again, cannot stress enough, if you are into really digging into the UFO phenomenon and cutting past the more sensational, speculative material out there, Christian Lambright's book is one of the better ones. And again, especially about the treatment of the disinformation side of it, because I think if you're going to seriously research the UFO phenomenon, you have to address that, because otherwise you're basically saying you're ignoring the liars in the room, and you have to address that before you can get a straight answer and a good bead on exactly what's happening. So anyway, I'll stop there. X-Descending by Christian Lambright, and this is copyright 2011. Excellent book, but I'll stop there. Thank you very much. And I'll put at the end, I'm going to link Project Beta and some other related material for those of you who are unfamiliar with this.